Hi, welcome back to the Half Naked Quilter. My name is Clay, and this is Season 1, Episode 6. My apologies for being so late in getting this next episode out. It's winter here in Palm Springs when I recorded this originally, and I managed to get a cold, and that turned into bronchitis, and then I had to have eye surgery. So that's all. I'm still sniffing a little bit, but most of that's gone now. So happy to be back. I'm really excited about this episode because this is the last piece of stuff that I need to teach you before you can go off and start your first quilt on your own. This is a really exciting day. The other good news is everything that you have to do today is stuff you already know how to do. So we're just going to put it together in a different way. But it's the exact same skills. There's nothing new going on in this episode at all. So remember in the last episode, what we did was sew your first quilt blocks together. In the last 2 episodes, actually. So in 2 episodes ago, I showed you how to do a block from start to finish. In the episode just previously, I showed those of you that are a little more adventurous how to do chain piecing, which gets to the same place. So at this point, you should have 7 blocks completed. What we're going to do today is take that one step further. We're going to put those together into a little mini quilt, just so you can see how the final assembly process goes. Once I show you how to do that, in the next episode, we'll walk through the first project. I'll show you everything you need. You can go off to the fabric store and buy your first fabric and get started on your first quilt. So, all right, back to my notes, because we've learned that if I don't have notes, I babble. We did this. Okay, so quick reminder where we are. Let's look at the table. So what you have is 7 completed blocks. We've also got some extra fabric here. Now, you probably have more than I do, because I've had to redo things a couple of times, or maybe you have the same amount as I do because you've made some mistakes and had to recut. But you've got a little bit of your light fabric left and a little bit of your dark fabric left. So that's where we stand right now. Today what we're gonna do is, if you remember, let me show you what a 9-patch quilt looks like when it's done. I showed you this at the beginning. Let me show you again. So I'll put up a picture of one of the 9 patches that I did several years ago. Remember, it's basically a checkerboard of checkerboards. So we have the pieced 9-patch blocks alternating with solid blocks. So all we have to do today is cut some solid blocks, and then we'll sew basically a little mini 3x3 quilt together, so you'll get to see how that process goes as well. Alrighty, so you got a stack of 7. We're gonna do a 3x3 grid. So let me show you how this is going to end up. So we'll have 3, and that's a 9-patch, and that's a 9-patch. We'll have another 3 below it with the 9-patch in the middle, and then another one here. So this is what we're going to make today, just as a way to practice putting together the blocks into a finished quilt top. So we already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to need 5 of the 9-patch blocks. We have 7, so you're going to have 2 extras, which is great because you've got into samples for later. The important thing here is we also need 1, 2, 3, 4 solid blocks. So first off, let's pull out the 5 blocks that we'll need. 1, 2, let's see, 3, 4, 5. Okay. We'll put the other 2, hold it, I didn't count right. 1, 2, 3, 4, there it is, 5. Okay, we're going to set the other 2 aside. We won't use those for the rest of this process. So you've got your 5 9-patch blocks. So I'm going to set these up here. What we need to do is cut 4 solid blocks. Now remember, the finished size of these 9-patch blocks is 9.5 by 9.5. So we're going to cut 4 9.5 by 9.5 inches squares out of either one of these fabrics. And honestly, because we're practicing, you can do it out of the light or you can do it out of the dark. Either one works. You probably have enough of both. So pick one of the 2. I'm going to do mine out of the light. So we'll set this dark aside. Now remember back in lesson, 3, I went through the process of how to cut squares out of fabric. Remember, it always starts with squaring your fabric to your grid on your cutting mat. That way you know that everything will be square as you're cutting, using that as a reference. So I've got the fold down here. We're gonna line that fold up on one of the horizontal lines, and we're gonna hang the edge just a little bit off one of the verticals, because remember we have to trim that so that this is now square to the tabletop. Alrighty. Here we go, grab the rotary cutter, line it up on that horizontal line. Remember, you've already done this before, we just haven't done it since like lesson 3 or something, right? There we go, throw that away. Okay, so now our fabric is square to the tabletop. Whether you chose the dark or the light, it doesn't matter. Now we need 4 9.5-inch squares. Now the cool thing here is this fabric that I'm using, and most quilt fabrics, are 43 to 44 inches, about 42 inches of usable because you have to cut the selvages off. Well, 9.5 and 9.5 is 19. So we can cut 2 9.5-inch squares out of one strip, but because it's folded over, we'll get all 4 that we need. So we only have to cut 1 9.5-inch strip. This is a lot bigger than the ones we cut before. Same process, right? So we're gonna come over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5. Line this up. There we go, 9.5, 9.5. There we go. Same thing we've done before, right? Oh, remember how we use cutting knives, rotary cutters, right? Sheathe until you're gonna use it, unsheath it, cut your strip, put the guard back on, right? All right, we're done with cutting. At least we're done with cutting off the yardage. So put the rest of yours away. So now we've got a 9.5-inch strip. Now remember, every time we cut fabric off the yardage, we're gonna start with one of the 2 sides of whatever rectangle or square we're cutting. This is a 9.5-inch square. So we're gonna cut a 9.5-inch strip and then cut 2 9.5s across the other way. Remember when we were doing the 3.5s earlier for the 9-patch block, we cut 3.5-inch strips. And then because it was a 3.5-inch square, we just cut 3.5, 3.5, 3.5, 3.5, right? It's the exact same process every time. Like I said, there's nothing new in this episode. So now we're gonna pivot this around. And again, line it up on one of the horizontal lines on your cutting mat. There we go. Grab the smaller of the 2 rulers because it's less unwieldy. Cut the selvages off just like we did last time. Now we're going to cut 9.5 and 9.5, and that'll get us the 4. Remember, this is folded over. It'll get us the 4 9.5 blocks we need to finish our little test quilt. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5. Drop the ruler down, line it up. There's our first one. We're going to bump it out so we can see. And there's the half. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There we go. And we're done. So that's the little scrap piece that we will save for another project. Great. So now we've got all 4 of the solid blocks that we need. So let's just do a quick test layout. Do I have room in the camera here? Oh, I do. Isn't that cool? Okay. So it'll be 9-patch, solid, 9-patch, and then a solid, and 9-patch, and a solid. Can you see down here? You can't. Okay. There's one more row though, right? So we've got, I'm going to overlap it so you can see it. One more row that just looks like this one, right? So this is how it's going to be when it's done. This is exactly like doing these 9-patch, but instead of doing with 3.5-inch squares, we're doing it with 9.5-inch squares, but it's the exact same process, which is why in this episode, you're not learning anything new. You already know everything you need to know. Alrighty, let's pick these up in rows. So there's the first row. There's the second row. There's the third row. Okay, so now we're all stacked up and ready to go to the sewing machine. This sewing process goes exactly the way it did before. We're gonna sew the first 2 together and then sew the second one onto the third one. We're gonna do 3 rows just like that. The only difference here is we've got seam allowances that are gonna come up along these seams that we're sewing. So as you're going, you have to make sure that they stay folded the right way that they were pressed. It's not the end of the world if they end up getting sewn opposite from the way they were pressed. Frankly, no one's ever going to see it. It really doesn't matter. But just for form's sake, right, to keep my best friend and my mother, who are very detail-oriented, happy, we're just going to make sure that we get those seam allowances tucked in exactly the direction they need to go as they're going under the needle. But aside from that, this is a straightforward process. So we're going to go over to the sewing machine. I'm going to do the first one in normal time, just so you can see me tucking those seam allowances in. And then I'll do the other two in fast motion. You don't need to see them. It's all the same thing, right? From that part done, remember when we were doing the 9-patch blocks, once we sewed the rows together, then we have to press them, right? And then we're going to sew the 3 rows together into a quilt. It's exactly like doing this with a 9-patch block. Now we're gonna treat the seam allowances slightly differently, but again, we're just pressing seam allowances, not a huge deal. So let's take these over to the sewing machine. I'll sew the first one in real time so you can watch me do it. We'll do the other 2, and then we'll go to the ironing board from there. Okay, here we are at the sewing machine. And for those of you playing along from home, this is my 4th take for this. I really struggled to figure out a way to put the camera in a place where you can see what I'm doing, but where I can still sew. So if you were watching me, I've got the tripod actually between my knees, and I'm reaching around both sides like this. Oh, things I didn't know I was going to have to figure out when I decided to do this series, huh? All right, so we're here at the sewing machine. We're going to be sewing our 3 rows of blocks together. So I'm going to put 2 of these to one side. We'll start with this one, which is a 9-patch, a solid, and a 9-patch. Keep in mind, this process is pretty much exactly what you did when you were sewing these blocks together. It's just on a bigger scale. So we're going to sew the 3 rows together, and then we're going to go over and press them, and then we're going to seam lock them, and then sew the rows to each other. It's really the same process. It's just on a larger scale. So let's grab the first 2 of the blocks here. All right, you'll notice that I've got like stray threads and stuff where I've ripped this out 2 or 3 times. All right, so let's get this set up to sew. One thing to pay attention to when you're sewing these blocks together is remember the last pressing we did when we sewed these 9-patch blocks together. We pressed these seam allowances in one direction, right? This isn't necessary, but it's sort of a thing to get in a good habit of doing, and that is as we sew these rows together, we want these seam allowances to point the same direction on this block and on the block that's on the other end of the row. It makes a really subtle difference from the front because these seams actually cast a little bit of a shadow and add some dimensionality to your quilt. Honestly, most people are never ever going to notice, and so if you don't do it, don't worry about it for now. If you're working on a quilt for a show or a contest or something, then yeah, you have to pay attention to stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world, but it's a good habit to get into. So we're going to start with these seam allowances going this way. So we will first start by matching up front corner here. And see, you can actually see this now. The other 3 versions of this that I did, you couldn't see what I was doing. Stick it under the needle. Get it started there. And then I'm going to drop the needle just to stabilize it. All right, one thing that you want to pay attention to when you're sewing pieced blocks together is line up the end. Once you get the beginning of it lined up and you've got it started, come down and line up the end. Now, if you want to do this at the table with pins, it's totally fine. I do it on the fly, but if it's easier for you to pin this first, go right ahead. That's what pins are for, right? So I'm going to hold this end. It's nice and matched up. Now, these pieced blocks, these sewn seams are a little bit elastic. And if for some reason the 2 things that you're sewing together aren't exactly the same length, you can give it a light tug, kind of like we do over at the ironing board, right? Give it a light tug, and like I said, these sewn seams are a little bit elastic, and so you can get them to line up. So I've got the edge lined up here. I'm holding the other end. So we go over that first seam allowance. And you see, I sewed this one a little bit wonky, but I know that this was right when I sewed it. over that one, and off the end. Whoop. There we go. So that lined up nice and neat. All right, now we'll go to the other side. Now we're going to have to flip this around because we want to sew it to the white one. Whether you put the piece block on top or the solid block on top, it's totally a matter of preference. I prefer to have the shorter piece that I'm working with on top and whatever the longer piece is underneath on the bottom, because it's a little easier for me to move things around and kind of get them oriented. But do what works for you, right? Okay, let's double check we've got our seams running the same way. Now remember, we flipped this block around, so now these seam allowances are going that way. So I'm going to spin this block around. Same thing. I'm going to line up the first corner, stick it under the needle, get it started. I'm going to drop the needle because I think that helps to stabilize. Come to the end, right? Line up the end points. There we go. I'm trying to do this where you can see it. So line up the end points, grab that and hold on to it. Nice little even tug. Make sure the edges are lined up. Now at this point, we've got these seam allowances going that way, right? Which means we're going to have to guide them under the presser foot. Because what will happen if you don't is they'll fold over the other way. Now at the end of the day, not terrible if you have a seam that's pressed this way on one way and it's been sewn this way on the other side. It's not the end of the world. Yeah, technically they should all be going the same way and you shouldn't have one that folds over like that, but you know me, if you can't see, it doesn't matter, right? So we're just going to continue to march here. Run that second one under and off the end. Okay, so we've got our first row for this little mini quilt all sewn. Yeah, there I go bumping it. See, I've got the tripod between my knees, which means I'm bumping it all the time. There we go. So easy, right? There's nothing really new here. All right, let's do the other two. I'll get this started and then we'll go to fast forward because there's no point in you watching me do this. Again, there's nothing really new here. Oh, let's double check our seam allowances. Okay, got it pointing down. Flip it back over. Alrighty, line up that front corner, right? Now notice I've got the pieced block on the bottom this time. I'm just going to show you how this works. It really doesn't matter. It's totally up to you. Get it started. I'm going to drop the needle for stability. Line up the end. Grab the points, right? Now when those seam allowances are on the bottom, you just have to flip it over and double check. Now in this case, because they're going this way, they're going to go under that presser foot without fighting us. You'll see in a moment, when we do this where these seam allowances are pointing that way, you have to double check them as they go under because they have a tendency to want to fold in the direction that you're sewing. So right before you go into the needle, you double check. These awls are really good for it because you can swipe it under there and move it where it belongs. Alrighty, so now we've got this lined up. And off the edge. Alrighty, and then we got to put a white one on the other side. We'll spin it around. Now there's only one of these piece blocks this time, so we don't really have to worry about which way those seam allowances are pointing because we're not trying to match them up with a second one. Match it up and get it started. I'm going to drop the needle for stability. Come down to the end. Match it up. Like I said, you can pin this. And there's totally fine. There we go, line it up. Now notice we've got these seam allowances going that way now. So we're going to sew up to that, flip it over, double check it's the right direction. Keep going. Come to the second one, flip it over. Yep, it's going the right direction. This is a time, if this was folded over like this, right? If it was going under this way, you can just take your awl and swipe it under there and you know it'll be the right direction. And we go off the edge. All right, there's the second one. Let me do the third one here. We'll go into fast motion so you don't have to watch me do it, but I wanted you to see how that works when you've got the seam allowances pointed the wrong way. Okay, all 3 rows are now done. So we're gonna go over to the ironing board now, and just like we did before, we're gonna iron the seam allowances. Then we'll go to the cutting table, pin the seam locks, come back here, sew the 3 rows together, and we'll have our little mini quilt done. So I will see you over at the ironing board. Okay, we're standing here at the ironing board. We've got our 3 rows here. Put one to one side. So when we sewed these 9-patch blocks together, we just ironed the seam allowances all in one direction and then just flip one around to do the seam locking, remember that? We could do the exact same thing here. We could iron these seam allowances all one way, just like we did for the 9-patch blocks, and then spin the middle one around and we'll be able to do the seam locking. We could do that, it would work just fine, there's nothing wrong with it. Let me show you though a trick. So if you look at the back of this block, if you fold the seam allowance towards the pieced block, we're going to end up with several layers of fabric all wadded up right here and also up here. And that, again, this is one of these nice things. It's a tip, but it's not necessary. If we press this to this side, we're going to have less layers of fabric here, and we're not going to have a little bump in our finished quilt. So what we're going to do, instead of pressing these seam allowances all one direction, we're going to press them towards the solid block. Because what that will do is keep us from having this big pileup of fabric right here. And we can get away with that and still do seam locking with these 9-patch blocks, because look what happens. Double check that I've got this where you can see it. I can't see my camera, so. Okay, so if we press these this way, the one that's gonna go next to it, again, we're pressing towards the solid block. Look what happens here. We end up with this one pressed this way and this one pressed this way. So we've got our seam allowances going in opposite directions so we can do seam locking. It's one of the quirks of the 9-patch layout that you can get away with this. So again, we could iron these all in one direction just like we did with the 9-patch blocks. But we're gonna do something a little sneaky, and we're gonna press them towards the solid block just so we avoid having this big old pile up of layers right here. Alrighty, so we've got it laid out. Grab the iron. Again, on this side, I'm giving it a little tug. Use just the heat and the weight of the iron. Remember, I came at it with the side of the iron. I like to go right to left, so I'm going to spin it around and do the other side. There we go. So that's got that set. We'll flip it over. Give it some steam. And that one's done. All right. We'll go into fast forward here so you don't have to watch me do this again. All right, so we've got all 3 of these rows pressed, and just like when we were piecing these 9-patch blocks, we're now going to go over to the cutting table and do the seam locking, right? We're going to pin these points. We'll put a couple of other pins in just for alignment purposes, and then go back over the sewing machine and sew the 3 rows together. So over to the cutting table. Okay, here we are back at the cutting table. Let me get rid of that. This is my list of stuff I have to reshoot. Okay. So we're going to do the seam locking now. So let's grab the first 2 here. And grab my pins. There we go. Okay. Flip one of these over. Now notice we've got these seam allowances running in opposite directions, so we're going to be able to do seam locking just fine. So get it lined up, put your finger over the top, slide until you feel it go thunk. Stick a pin in right over the stitching. This is exactly what we did when we did the 9-patch blocks, guys. This is nothing new. Same thing here. Line it up, slide till you go thunk, falls into place. Stick a pin right in at the stitching line. There we go. And then we'll go ahead and line up the other ends just so we'll have that ready for us when we go into the needle and we don't have to go fighting for it. All right. Now, one thing to notice here, if you'll notice, the solid white block looks like it's a little longer than the piece block underneath, but remember I told you those sewn seam allowances are a little elastic, and so when we go under the needle, we'll just give it a gentle tug. These will open up just a little bit, and we'll be just fine. Now, anything more than a gentle tug, you're gonna end up with puckers and pleats, but this is pretty common that they don't start off the same and you give them just a gentle tug, and those elastic seams on the other side even out and everything comes out fine. If it's more than that, then you've got to go figure out why they're different lengths. Maybe you sewed the block underneath, the seam allowances were too big, and so it actually really is shorter. But for these purposes, like I said, this little bit of a difference is really common, so don't let it freak you out. All right, we'll go over to the sewing machine now. We'll sew this. You would come back, pin the second one. I'm not gonna make you watch that because you've done this before. We did this all before. So we'll go over to the sewing machine, we'll sew these, and then I'll skip the step of doing the second one because like I said, it's all the same thing. And then we'll be over at the ironing board again to do the final seam allowances. Okay, back at the sewing machine here, we're gonna sew these rows together. Again, this isn't anything you haven't already done before, it's just on a bigger scale. So we'll get the beginning of it started. I'm going to drop the needle for stability. Double check we've got these edges lined up. We're going to give this a gentle tug. I'm going to hold where that pin is at the next seam lock, just until we get partway through this. And off to the races we go. Now when we get down to here, this underneath seam allowance has to be pointed that way, so I'm going to use my awl just to sweep it and make sure that it's pointed the wrong way. Remember, we pull the needle out at the last minute when we're doing seam locking. Same thing's going to happen here as we go through with the piece block underneath. Now notice these seam allowances are going that way, so again, we're going to have to double check them before it goes under the needle. I just give it a little sweep, make sure it's pointed the right way. Little sweep, make sure it's pointed the right way. Is that one pointed the right way? Yeah. Pull the pin out at the last minute. And then we got the last one to do here. Like I said, folks, this is nothing new. You've done this. I promised you when we started this episode that there weren't any new skills here. There aren't. This is all stuff you know how to do. We're just doing it on a bigger scale. One of the things I love about 9-patch, pull that pin out, and there we go. And if everything worked well, let's see if our corners matched up. Yep, that one matched up just like it should. And woo, this one matched up like it should. Remember I told you this is like my fourth pass through on this particular segment or set of segments. They didn't line up the first time, but that's okay. Remember, if one of these seam locks for some reason slips on you, just go back, tear it out, go at least one sewn seam beyond it on both sides, re-seam lock it, right, re-pin it, and then guide it into the thing, and be really, really careful that you pull the pin out at the last minute. It's not the end of the world. If it doesn't line up to your satisfaction, this one's maybe a hair off. I'm not going to worry about it because you know me. If you can't tell from a galloping horse, it doesn't matter. There we go, straight thread. If for some reason it didn't line up properly, just rip it out beyond at least one of the sewn seams. Because remember I told you, these are elastic, and so this is where you're going to get that alignment from. Repin it, come back under the needle, start here, sew through it, make sure you pull the pin at the last minute so that this stays aligned, and through to the other side. Now, remember I told you we hardly ever do stitch locking, right, where you go the back and forth thing at the beginning? If you have to stop and do a fix like this, you're going to want to do that because, remember, we don't have to do it because there's going to be a seam crossing it. Well, here there's not going to be a seam crossing it. So if you do have to do one of these fixes where you have to rip out part of it, come back, re-seam lock it and re-stitch it. Make sure you lock it on both ends. Alrighty. Now we'll do the last one, which again, you'll probably go back to the cutting table and do the seam locking with the pins. I do these on the fly, so I'm just going to do it on the fly version because there's no point in dragging you through that again. And I'm on the wrong end. Really, Clay? Yep, I am. You know, it's funny. I did that in all three of the other versions as well. Oh goodness. All right. I'm putting it down to the horrible cold I'm getting over. We'll just say I'm still stuffed up. You can probably hear it a little bit. Oh, I came unthreaded. Look at that. Alrighty, and it's gonna happen. It's not the end of the world. Sometimes that happens. Just stop and rethread. I promised you at the first episode when we started this whole journey together that I was going to make mistakes on camera because you're going to make mistakes, and I want you to see, you know, we're not all perfect all the time in this business. Quilters spend a lot of time going, okay, how can I fix this? I know very few quilters that can do things once and done and it's all fine. I am definitely not one of them. All right, we'll get that started. Cool, that one lined up. And that one lined up. All right, we've got the whole thing sewn together now. We've just got one more round of ironing to do, and this is done. All right, I will see you back over the ironing board. Okay, here we are, last pass of the ironing board. It's all stitched together. This is always really exciting, but you know, again, at this point, you've got the whole thing stitched together and you're fighting yards, yards and yards of fabric. All right, so now we just need to do what we did when we did these blocks. We just need to press the seam allowances all in one direction, right? Doesn't matter which one you choose. Again, there's a little fussy thing where you choose which way you press the seam allowances because it puts the little shadow of the seam in different places. Honestly, we're not gonna worry about that now. I hardly ever worry about that. About the only time anybody's gonna care is if you're entering a quilt in a competition. And I don't have a lot of patience with the quilt competitions anyway. So, alrighty, so we're gonna press this seam allowance this way, then we'll come back and we'll press the seam allowance the same direction. I'm gonna do it from the end just because I find that a little easier for me. All right, I gotta wake up my iron. There we go. Okay. So we'll come at it from the side just like we did before. A little bit of heat. A little bit of heat. And you'll end up doing this in sections, and trust me, you're gonna get really good at this. Can you imagine when you're doing this process on the last couple of rows you've sewn on a king size? You've got fabric piled off all three ends of the ironing board. It's really quite funny to watch. Okay, now we're gonna do this one same way. So we'll press that this way. Honestly, I don't mind making the bigger quilts. I got some stuff to trim here at some point. I don't mind making the bigger quilts until you get to this last stage where you're sewing all the rows together and you've literally got like, you know, 7-8 yards of fabric all piled up. You're trying to horse that around and have it not try to have a mind of its own. That's when having a larger studio is actually really nice. I've done king size ones in this little small space I'm in right now. It's a struggle. It's a struggle. Okay. So we've got those set. Now we'll give it some steam. And more. Is that the right side? Yep. And last little bit. And just a tip here, when I get to the end of this process, I like to give the whole thing one more just good light steaming all over. to knock out the wrinkles from me moving the fabric from place to place, I just give the whole thing one more nice light steaming. There we go. Cool. Whole thing is put together. So we've done our little, you've actually done an actual quilt. I mean, it's, 36 inches by 36 inches, but you've done one. All right, let's go back over to the cutting table and talk about next steps. Okay, folks, we're back here to the cutting table. You've just finished your very first quilt. Now, granted, it's really small, but you've done everything you need to do to be able to do a larger one. I'm actually really excited about this. Over the course of 6 lessons, you've learned all of the basic skills to create your very first quilt. I can't tell you how excited I am about this. This is a cool point because at this point, in the next episode, I'll walk you through your first project. We'll talk about all the steps. We'll talk about how many squares you're going to make and how many you're going to cut out and how much yardage you need. I will go through all of that. What I am going to do is give you 2 versions of that project. So for those of you that are beginners, now remember, at the end of the sewing process, you're horsing the entire thing under the needle all at once, and that's a lot to manage if you're not used to doing this. So I'm going to give you 2 versions. I'm going to give you a lap quilt / kind of baby quilt version, which isn't quite as unwieldy. There's not nearly as many blocks. So it's a little easier for those of you that are beginners. I will also give you a twin bed version for those of you that have some experience sewing and aren't kind of thrown off by dealing with all that much fabric. Honestly, the only difference between the lap size and the twin size is the number of blocks. It's all the same stuff, it's just the number of blocks. One of the nice things about 9-patch again. So in the next episode 7, I'll walk you through the project. I'll tell you how much fabric to buy. I'll give you the list of how many squares you're gonna cut and how many blocks you're gonna make. You already know the layout, so it's easy, right? And then I'm also going to give you some tips about picking your fabric. A lot of quilters start off by working with kits, and a kit has the instructions and all of the fabric that you need. All of those decisions are already made. I didn't want to go that route because I'm not in the business of selling fabric. So I'm going to give you some ideas about how to choose the fabrics for your first project. If you feel comfortable making those choices yourself, knock yourself out, go to the store, buy what you like, right? If you're a little more hesitant, you're not as comfortable walking to a fabric store and making sure you're making good choices, I'm going to give you a couple of really, really easy kind of design hacks that will make it really simple for you to pick the fabrics yourself. Trust me, you can do this. It's, again, like a lot of this process, it's not rocket science. So don't worry. I will give you some tips about how to choose the fabrics for your first project, if you're feeling hesitant about that at all. And then at that point, I will send you off to go make your first quilt. I'm actually really excited about this process because my whole point behind doing this series was to give beginners the tools that you needed to be able to get into this wonderful craft, and you're ready. So at the end of that episode, I'll send you off and you'll buy your fabric and you'll make your first quilt. So you're ready to go. So I will see you in episode 7, and we'll talk about your first project. Bye.